We have two presentations this afternoon, and I think we'll take questions after the two presentations. So if you have a question from presentation one, please note that and have it prepared. The first one this afternoon is a study of the experiences of... I may as well get the right one. Okay. The educational experiences and outcomes of children with special educational needs, phase 2, from age 9 to 13. This is a secondary analysis of data from the Growing Up in Ireland study. I would have great pleasure now in introducing Dr. Peter Archer and Caroline McKeown. When I looked up Peter Archer in a Google search, the first hit said, Peter Archer is an Australian entrepreneur and martial arts champion. He is an actor well known for starring with Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon and other martial arts films. We know him better as Chief Executive Officer of the Educational Research Centre. I first met Peter some 35 years ago when I was a young teacher in Cork, and I was very struck at the time by the interest he showed as an academic and as a researcher in tackling educational disadvantage. And then I discovered he was from Cork, which of course explained everything. Caroline McKeown is a research associate with the ERC, and she has a particular interest in student engagement, educational equity, and child and family well-being. And I think for the purposes of this study, we were very well served by them and by others on their team. In its call for tender, the NCSE noted that despite significant investment to support children with special educational needs, there is only limited evidence relating to the engagement, well-being, progress and other outcomes of these pupils. We look forward to hearing about your key findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm a bit alarmed that you discovered my secret life from down under. I made no such promise about the women's football team, so I'm going to mention them, and indeed the Camogie team as well. Carol and I have a very unequal division of labour. Basically, she's going to do pretty much all the work. I'm just going to set the context for that report. The first part of the context that I think we need to highlight is that this presentation is a kind of a preview of a report which is currently being finalised. The details of the report are on the slides that you're looking at right now, and it's important to note that it's a study which is a collaborative effort between our centre and what was the St. Patrick's College Special Education Department, but is now the DCU Institute of Education School of Inclusive and Special Education. Jude Cosgrove, who's the senior author on the report, she's a former member of staff at the Research Centre. She no longer works in the centre, although she is a member of the centre's new 5-person board. Caroline and I are both employees of the centre. Joe Travers, Zita Lysett and Noreen Yvrin are in the DCU Institute of Education partner. Another feature of the study is that it's important to mention and acknowledge is that the study has an advisory committee which has contributed to the study and until very recently, in fact. It's also important to point out that the study, and therefore the presentation, is based entirely on data from the Growing Up in Ireland study. In particular, it uses data collected from 9-year-olds and their families and their schools in 2007 and 2008, and again from those same children and their families in 2011-2012 when they were 13. Hence, you'll find references to two cohorts, the 9-year-old cohort and the 13-year-old cohorts. The strength of the study, this particular study, and growing up in Ireland in general, is that it's longitudinal, and therefore you're looking at the same individuals and families at two different points in time. This is an overview of Caroline's presentation, and I hope it pretty much speaks for itself. It's going to be a very selective look at the findings because there's a lot of them. It's going to be a very long report, and time is limited. It's going to look at prevalence and stability. What's at issue there is that the longitudinal nature of the study allows for two separate estimates of prevalence of special education needs. And stability refers to the kind of movement that there is between these groups over time. The next, Caroline will move on to look at some key findings relating to children's outcome at age 13, and then look at progress between age 9 and 13, and try to identify, at least in a very preliminary way, what accounts for any changes that have occurred over time. And then she'll briefly identify some key findings. Before I finish my context setting, there's one or two things that I want to mention. First of all, we have tried to strip out of the presentation a lot, nearly all, I would say, of the technical statistical detail from the report, but when the report appears, it will inevitably have a fair amount of technical statistical stuff in it. It's maybe also important to flag that the categorization system that was used in our first report, which related only to the 9-year-old cohort, we've had to modify that a little bit with a lot of input and help from the advisory committee. So if those of you who may very well remember very well the previous report, will find some differences between the categorization system. Also related to that, the subgroups of special education needs that we use are not homogeneous. So, for example, one of the subgroups, physical and sensory difficulties or conditions, although it's the smallest subgroup in the whole study with only 50 people or something, it contains a wide range of different difficulties or conditions, like physical difficulties, hearing difficulties, visual difficulties. So while we tried to establish separate subcategories within that particular subcategories, we weren't able to do so simply because of the small numbers. The final point that I want to make by way of introduction is that in a study of this kind, a large part of it is inevitably going to involve comparisons of children with and without special education needs. And this can be problematic in two ways. First of all, it reflects some of the ways of thinking that I think Roger was challenging this morning in terms of his trying to push out the notion of inclusiveness. And the second way in which it can be problematic is that it can tend to obscure what are in fact positive findings or good news stories, if you like. So, for example, where there are instances of progress being made between 9 and 13 years for children with special education needs, they can kind of be overshadowed by the fact that children without special education needs are making greater progress. And there are other instances where in relation to things like transition from primary school to post-primary school, the results are positive for both groups. It's just that they're a little bit less positive for the special education needs. So, but I don't think there's a way of doing this kind of research that doesn't involve making those comparisons. So, with that, I'll just let Caroline take over. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to bring you through some of the slides, and hopefully I'll stick to time as much as possible. So first off, to look at prevalence and stability. So you can see here that at age 9, about 20% of children have special educational needs. And that's a revision based on what we saw in the first report, just using an updated classification. There was just a reassignment of some children to different groups based on feedback from the advisory committee. And then at age 13, it's just under 18%. So you can see this, there is a small difference, a small drop, but it's broadly similar across those two ages. And then when we look at the next slide, so there's very little change in prevalence, but this slide represents kind of a different picture in terms of stability of groups between age 9 and age 13. So you can see that for social-emotional behavioural difficulties, there's stability across those two groups, but perhaps looking at general learning difficulties and disability, there's a difference there, and the same for specific learning difficulties as well. And for multiple special educational needs, there is kind of a drop in the prevalence there. And just looking at stability of special educational needs again, so this is one of the classifications that we use where we've collapsed the groups slightly just into no special educational needs, needs at age 9 only, so at the time of the first data collection, needs at age 13 only, and then children who had kind of a continuity in terms of they had special education needs at both age 9 and age 13, but this doesn't mean that they stayed within the same group. So just in this table you can see that about 27% of children had special educational needs at any age, and at 16% of children had needs at age 9 or 13, so split between those two categories, and about 11% of children had that continuous special educational need between age 9 and age 13. So for children with the continuous classification at age 9 and age 13, children with ASD were the most stable group between those two ages, at 85% staying within that group. Children with multiple special educational needs and children with general learning difficulties were least likely to stay in that group between age 9 and age 13. About half of the children with physical and sensory difficulties and social-emotional behavioural difficulties remained in their groups at age 13, and there's more information in the report on this, and I think it's kind of one of the most interesting contributions of the report. Looking at the children who have special educational needs at only age 9 or only age 13, so 3 in 10 children who had it at age 9 but don't have it at the time of the age 13 data collection. 3 in 10 has SEBD, 3 in 10 had general learning difficulties, and 1 in 6 had specific learning difficulties. We have a similar kind of group of children then that were identified at the time of the second data collection at age 13. 4 in 10 had SEBD, 1 in 7 had general learning difficulties, and 3 in 10 children had specific learning difficulties. So looking at the relationship then between socioeconomic status and special educational need, just to say there is a strong relationship between SES and special education need found among the 13-year-old children. And this was also found in the previous report when children were age 9. Now, Growing Up in Ireland was not designed with the intention of addressing issues like clustering at school level, but there is evidence of clustering of special educational need in certain types of schools. There is a kind of a range of indicators looking at socioeconomic data, but one of the ones just to present today is there's a bidirectional evidence in terms of financial stress. So there's higher percentages of children in families with special needs children were worse off, and then there was also higher percentages that were better off in terms of their financial stress. So there's a kind of a dip in the middle and a higher proportion at either end compared to children in families without special educational needs. So just to move on to children's outcomes at age 13 now, and looking at the progress and change that they've made between age 9 and age 13, and we're just going to focus on a few select issues. There is a lot more content in the report, but just looking at children's liking of school at age 13. So you can see here that a large majority of children with or without special educational needs report liking school at least a bit. So it's a kind of about 90% for children without special needs and about 83% for children with special educational needs. That's looking at those first three columns. And reports of disliking of school were twice as frequent among children with special educational needs than compared to children without special educational needs. So we could say, it's fair to say that a large majority of children with or without special needs report liking school at least a bit. But there is reports of disliking school were twice as frequent for children with special needs. And children with physical or sensory difficulties were almost 10 times more likely to hate school, that final category, the most extreme category, than children without special educational needs. Children with social emotional behavioural difficulties also reported high rates of disliking school, so it was about 13.3%. And almost 1/3 of children with ASD reported liking school very much. So there is variation in experience of children liking and disliking school among the categories. One of the other outcomes that we're looking at is the well-being of children at age 13, and the measure that's used for this is the Piers-Harris measure, and it has just to let you know, has a total scale, but there are 6 subscales within that. So all groups of children with special educational needs reported significantly lower total well-being scores than children without special educational needs. And then on one of the subscales, freedom from anxiety, 5 of the 7 groups of children had significantly lower scores than children without special needs. And within those, it's children with social emotional behavioural difficulties, children with multiple special needs had the lowest scores. And those were moderate to large differences, which would be fairly significant. On the happiness and satisfaction subscale, children with SEBD, children with multiple special needs, and children with special needs at age 9 only. So these children don't have a special educational need at the time of the second data collection at age 13, had significantly lower scores than children without SEN. And then what we did with the well-being scores is we took into account their well-being at age 9. So compared to children without special needs, children in all of the 7 groups were significantly more likely to report lower well-being. Children with social emotional behaviour difficulties, ASD, physical and sensory difficulties, general learning difficulties, and multiple special needs were the most likely to report lower well-being. And then specifically looking at children with emotional and behavioural difficulties, they were 5 times more likely to report lower well-being compared to children without special needs. And one of the other findings that I'm just going to focus on today is looking at children's achievement in terms of their verbal reasoning and numeric ability. It's their kind of their reading and their maths. They're slightly different measures at age 13, but they're kind of comparable across the two ages. So compared to children without special needs, 4 of the 7 groups had significantly lower scores on the verbal reasoning test. That's SEBD, GLDD, specific learning difficulties, and SEN at age 9 only. So those 4 groups had significantly lower scores on kind of what we call the verbal reasoning kind of reading test. 5 of the 7 groups, so almost all of the groups of children, had significantly lower scores on the numeric ability test. And children with physical and sensory difficulties and children with multiple difficulties did not have statistically significant scores on both tests compared to children without special needs, nor did children with ASD on the verbal reasoning test. So just looking at maths and numeric ability at age 13, just to focus on that area, before we adjust for maths score at age 9 and how they did it in the previous test, 6 of the 7 groups, except the physical sensory group, had significantly lower scores. But after we adjust for how they did on the maths test at age 9, the differences between children without special needs and these children are smaller. So 4 groups have significantly lower scores once you take into account how they did at an earlier age. So children with general learning difficulties had the largest difference in maths achievement. The difference will be medium to large in size. And the differences for specific learning difficulties, special needs at age 9 only, and SEBD are in the small to medium range. And just moving on to look at transition to post-primary school. So this is one of the kind of key areas of the report as well, and it's been mentioned a lot today. So a large majority of parents reported that their children settled well into a post-primary setting throughout all of the Growing Up in Ireland children at age 13. However, when we look at children with special educational needs, 1 in 5 parents reported that their child did not settle in well. So it's a kind of about, I think, 94% of parents with children without special needs settled in well, but it was just under 80% of parents of children without special educational needs. And there is variation amongst the children with special needs. It's about 92% transitioned well for special needs at age 9, closely followed by the physical and sensory group at just about 91%, to the lower groups, which were ASD at 72% and social emotional behavioural difficulties also at about 73%. So there is a variation in the transition experiences of children with special educational needs. So just moving on to look at what change and progress over time, what matters. We did some multi-level models. So this is we're trying to look at what predictors of well-being, so taking the finding that we've already looked at, what characteristics have an association in the data with children's well-being at age 13, and this is looking at that Pearce-Harris measure again. So having special educational needs at age 9 and age 13, and children who had special educational needs at age 13 only, was a predictor of a lower well-being score, as was being bullied at age 9, or being a girl, or being in second year, or being part of a one-parent household at ages 9 and 13. Being bullied at age 13 is associated with lower well-being scores, and children who were bullied at age 9, so looking at them now at age 13, had a moderate-sized association with their well-being at age 13. So this does suggest that there is a longer-term negative impact of bullying. Just to explain as well, there's an interaction here with gender. So when you look, what it's just saying is kind of differences when we look at gender and the groups. So you have no special educational needs, children who have special needs at age 9 only, those were identified at age 13 only, and those that had their special needs at age 9 and 13. So for the groups that have it at age 9 only and age 13 only, there's a difference in gender. So the scores on the left there is higher well-being scores for boys rather than girls. So there is a difference for children. Boys have better well-being scores when there's no special educational needs, but the gap between girls and boys is greater for children who are identified at age 9 only and at age 13 only. But there does seem to be some sort of levelling there between girls and boys at age 9 and 13, so those children that have kept their special needs status per se. So for all children, boys have significantly higher well-being. Gender difference in favour of boys is only for those two groups that I've mentioned. And I think it is quite surprising that there is similar levels of well-being for those groups that have consistent needs at age 9 and age 13. So going back and looking at maths achievement now that we've already looked at, and looking at a model of looking at the prediction of maths achievement at age 13, after taking into account children's maths scores at age 9, children with special needs have lower than expected maths scores at age 13. Children with special needs at both ages 9 and 13 have the lowest maths achievement. So when there's consistency in the special needs, they have the lowest maths achievement, a difference that is small to medium in size. Children with special needs at age 9 only and age 13 only have scores that have a small but significant difference in maths achievement when they're compared to children without special needs. So looking at the list here of the predictors, the different characteristics that for maths and maths achievement at age 13. So it's being in one of those special needs groups, having a lower maths score at age 9, being a girl again, being in second year, having parents with lower educational attainment, being in a DESH Band 1 primary school, so when they transitioned to post-primary, reporting a lower liking of school, and also being in a post-primary DESH school. So I have a few minutes left to bring you through some of the key findings and implications. I'll just first look at prevalence and stability. So Looking here, the prevalence estimates of special needs are similar for age 9 and 13. However, there is movement within and between groups of children with and without SEN. So that's quite an important difference. Looking at the profile of children who had special needs at age 9 only and those who had needs at age 13 only, there is more pronounced variation in prevalence for some groups, so particularly SEBD. So we would, kind of looking at some of the implications, ongoing assessment of children would seem to be required, recognising the variation in prevalence over time, and this would have an impact on professional development and support. The availability of assessment tools is important to identify social-emotional behavioural difficulties. And this is something that is kind of consistent with our earlier report when we looked at age 9, when we presented here 2 years ago. So the literature on point and cumulative prevalence suggests that it's worth monitoring these children with social-emotional behavioural difficulties as they progress into adolescence, particularly children that may have internalising behaviours that tend to wax and wane over time. So there's a close association between socioeconomic status and special educational needs, and it's evident throughout the findings, at individual and at school levels. The gender differences for children with special education needs are also highlighted in the findings. And there'll be strong evidence from this analysis to support the inclusion of socioeconomic disadvantage measures and gender in the new model for resource allocation. So these, while Growing Up in Ireland was not designed to look at these school level issues, it is quite apparent in the data. So looking at a range of other findings and implications, there's continuity in many of the outcomes for children. However, outcomes for many of the groups of children with special education needs are still lower than for children without special educational needs. A majority of children with special needs report that they like school. However, children with special needs are more likely to report a lower liking of school, and poor student engagement can start early. So the results show that for some children it does worsen over time. And while 4 out of 5 parents report that their children who have special education needs transition well to post-primary school, children with SEN transition less well to post-primary school than children without special educational needs. And given these higher rates of less positive transition experiences in this study, for children with special needs, targeted supports may be best placed to support some children, covering both educational and socio-emotional elements. And I think perhaps this tallies with some of the issues raised in other people's presentations this morning, looking at a sense of belonging for children in post-primary settings and better supporting their transition to post-primary settings, will possibly foster a greater sense of belonging and maybe improve their liking of school and their general experience. Children with special needs have significantly lower maths and numeric ability achievement than expected. So there is a difference in children's achievement in reading and maths. There is a gap in maths achievement that is widening over time. Dislike of school at primary at age 9 is associated with lower achievement in maths at age 13. So there may be a rebalancing between literacy and numeracy supports given this widening gap in mathematics. For some children, their well-being has improved, so compared to their well-being at age 9. This was more pronounced for children with special educational needs, which is kind of a very positive finding, and it's something that's kind of one of the most positive findings in the report. However, at age 13, each of the 7 groups of children with special needs report significantly lower scores of well-being than children without special needs. And looking at these scores, children with social-emotional behavioural difficulties and general learning difficulties, and then that multiple unclassified special needs group, they do less well in terms of their well-being. Children with special needs at age 9 are children with special needs at age 9 only are doing less well than expected. So this suggests that there's a longer term impact of having special educational needs in childhood. So these children have lost their status as having special educational needs, and possibly the supports that were available to them, but it does seem that those children are doing less well over time when we compare them to other children that never had special educational needs identified in the study. Thank you.